welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you can join us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap that exists between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that in episode 102, we're joined by two guests. David Geslak, who we had back on episode 69 to talk about autism and exercise, and Dr. Haylie Miller. She is a researcher at the University of Michigan School of Kinesiology who specializes in autism research. And this is going to be a really fun conversation because we're going to be bouncing back and forth between the theory and the research and the practical application of working with the autistic population. As we talked back in episode 69, as we're going to discuss in this conversation, fitness professionals have a real opportunity to fill a much needed gap with the autism population. And this discussion is going to get into not only the research nuance of working with this population, but more importantly, how it can be applied practically when working with these individuals in an exercise setting. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 102. Please enjoy this conversation with David Geslak and Dr. Haylie Miller. Today, we're delighted to be joined by two guests, Dr. Haylie Miller and David Geslak. Thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, excited to be here again.
So, yeah, David, as you just said, you've been on before. Dr. Miller, you are a professor at the School of Kinesiology at U of M, where this podcast is based out of, and where I'm also a faculty lecturer. So this is going to be a fun conversation, taking both a very applied perspective from David's point of view, and then Dr. Miller, from your point of view, the research around exercise and autism. But before we launch into this, and David, I'll turn to you first. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of your background, just to give our audience some context?
Sure. Completely fell into working with those with autism or those who identify as autistic in 2004. I began actually in the Big Ten, not Michigan, but at Iowa football as an intern and then student assistant strength and conditioning coach. And I left there when I graduated in 2003. 9 months later, started a gym that was always meant for kids. But just to keep the doors open, I had to train athletes and adults. And at the time when we were thinking kids, we were thinking, kids who are overweight. Not that has really changed, but a dad I was training brought me his son on the autism spectrum. And back then I had learned really nothing about autism in my undergrad. And the dad said, can you teach him sports, but he can't skip. And as Dr. Haylie and a lot of people know, a neurotypical child that is shown to skip is shown to read better than a child who cannot. And that is actually one thing I did learn in my undergrad. So the long story short is I got him to skip in 4 sessions. Using the strategies that I was in charge of at Iowa football. I was in charge of the incoming freshmen, and I had to break down their Olympic movements to teach them better, right? To increase their power, their strength, reduce their risk of injury. And I used that same strategy and applied it to this boy to teach him to skip. And I got him to skip in 4 sessions when the parents and the therapeutic team had been trying for years. And 20 years later, almost 20 years later, here we are. So that's the long story short.
Yeah, and we'll link up to your previous Wellness Paradox episode where you give a little bit more context on your background and the things that your organization, Exercise Connection, does. Dr. Miller, let's turn to you. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I'm a developmental psychologist by training. I'm in the School of Kinesiology. I lovingly refer to myself as a goose in a pond full of ducks, right? Because I'm always on the run, always trying to learn new things about the field of movement science, because my interest really started from cognitive and social development. But as I was studying in graduate school, I got really interested in how we put things together in our world and how neurodivergent people integrate information together to produce behavior. And so that's what really kind of sent me in this direction of visual and motor development, which is what I study now. And you'll hear me as we talk today refer to neurodivergent people using identity first language, mostly because there have been some recent published papers suggesting that in the United States, that's what English speaking neurodivergent adults prefer. It's also what our community advisory team suggests. So I just want to throw that out there as a disclaimer, because I do think language is really personal. And in general, when we meet with families one-on-one, we match to whatever the individual's preference is. But for the purpose of today, you'll hear me say autistic rather than person with autism. At any rate, so I kind of went down this rabbit hole of interest in movement and vision. And our goal as a team for the research side is really what we call habilitation rather than rehabilitation. We're not interested in trying to pull someone toward what we might think of as typical or quote unquote normal function, because their brains and their bodies are not wired for that in the same way. Rather, what we want to do is understand the mechanisms that drive visual and motor differences and make sure that we can work within those, work with a person's body to help them exercise and move and engage in physical activity in ways that are safe and comfortable, so that we can reduce sedentary behaviors, reduce fall risk, and really just help people to get out and get moving in their environments the ways that they want to.
Awesome. Dr. Miller, you used a term that I think it's really important to just define right up front so we don't confuse anyone. You used the term neurodivergent. Can you just give a basic definition of that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the most important thing to know about the term neurodivergent is it is meant to be a term of inclusion rather than a term of exclusion. So it's meant to include anyone whose brain works differently than typical. So this can include people who have acquired differences in their brain, so people with traumatic brain injury, people who have had a stroke. It can also include people who have sort of innate differences in their wiring, like autistic people, people with ADHD, people with developmental coordination disorder. So really kind of a wide swath, but just sort of referring to anybody whose neural system functions in a way that's different from typical.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's important to level set so we don't have a bunch of people Googling as we're talking.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
So David, I'm gonna flip this back to you, and this is going to be one of those neat discussions where we're going to be able to bounce back and forth between kind of real world application and the great clinical research that Dr. Miller and her team are doing. And David, we talked about this on our podcast originally that you and I did, but can you frame up the opportunity that exists for the fitness professionals that are listening to this to work with individuals with autism?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, when I started back in 2004, there was like a handful of us, right, trying to work with this community and understand this community. And back then I said, look, I think in many ways, and Michael, I know you've shared this, but maybe not, these are my words, not yours, but the fitness community is kind of watered down, right? It's gotten better over the years, but in 2004, yeah, you didn't see highly qualified individuals going out and training people. And I was worried about this, coming from an ACSM background in 2004. And the more I learned about those with autism and was working with them, I felt that this is where it could go. And in many ways, this is happening for those with autism, those who are autistic or different disabilities. And so with all that being said, given what is happening in our public schools and our school systems, not every one of them, but many of them, the quality of physical education is not there. The professionals, and not their fault, but some of these professionals aren't even equipped and educated to work with those with autism or a variety of disabilities in a physical education setting. So that, again, to answer your question, this leads the fitness world that if the schools aren't going to value physical education, not just for those who have a disability, but quite frankly, for neurotypical kids or adult kids, where are they going to go? And I think there's an opportunity here for the fitness industry and for professionals who are qualified, who are trained, who understand the research, but go through accredited coursework and or an accredited certificate for them to have an opportunity, as I say, and probably Haylie can understand this too, but that you can have a client for life once that they're engaged in that routine and they value exercise and they have a connection with you as the trainer. Again, many of them are very routine and structured. And if they want to come and they schedule an appointment for you Monday at 3:00, more than likely they are always going to be there Monday at 3:00.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point.
There too, right, Dave? Like
Yes.
you better be there too, or you're going to be in trouble.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, it is both a business opportunity and a public health opportunity at very much the same time. And the irony is we sit here and have this discussion with Dr. Miller and I, both teaching in the AES program at U of M. That actually is an outgrowth of our former physical education program that was sunsetted and then spun up into this other program. So, certainly there is this opportunity. But David, you brought it up. It's not just a desire to work with that population. It's also having the technical competencies and skills to be able to appropriately work with that population. And we're going to get into some of the practical aspects of that in a second. But, Dr. Miller, based upon your research, what are some of the unique motor challenges that individuals with autism face just regard to, just general movement, but then exercise?
Yeah, great question. So I'll tell you, we talk about this a lot in the disability and movement class that I teach that's cross-listed between applied exercise science and movement science. And one of the things that I really like for students to know is that autistic people can get there in terms of the same types of fitness activities you might do with a neurotypical person, but the structure has to be a little bit different. You might need different levels of physical cueing or modeling because body awareness and interoception and proprioception is different in this population. So understanding your own internal body states, understanding where your body is in the world and your spatial distance to other things, how much force you need to exert on something, all of that is different perceptually in autism. And so we've got to do some extra steps to make sure that the person we're working with really understands what we're asking them to do and is doing it safely and with good form. The other thing that's different in this population is balance is quite different. Reliance on vision for balance is quite different. And the ability to balance under challenging circumstances can be tough. And so what we want to make sure that we do is really focus at the beginning on core strength and stability types of activities so that that person has a good foundation before we start to work too much peripherally. And so we're making sure that we're keeping them from high fall risk. We see that autistic young adults 18 to 35 fall like 5 to 6 times more often than their neurotypical counterpoints, to the point that it requires clinical intervention. They're going to the doctor, they're being injured, they're seeking care in a medical setting. Autistic older adults 50 and up are falling 12 times more often than their neurotypical counterparts. And so this is huge. This is a phenomenal opportunity, like you said, for public health and also from a business perspective, to get in and really focus on balance, because it's not something that would necessarily require physical therapy to a certain degree. Like, this is something we could address in a more informal, casual, regular, recurring type of setting that wouldn't require someone to go all the way through the hoops and red tape of the healthcare system. That's another thing that I would say is really important, is that autistic people find it overwhelming to get through all the red tape sometimes. And so as simple as you can make the process of signing up for a session, as simple as you can make an intake process, as straightforward as you can make your instructions and your communication, the better. Be super candid, be very direct, and everything will work out great. But those are just kind of some of the major differences that I would see with this population.
Yeah, great point.
Can I say something, Michael? Yeah, and I mean, just so the audience is clear too, Dr. Haylie and I have worked together in the past, and I love just hearing her insight, and also for the fitness professionals listening, what she said sometimes can maybe be overwhelming in a certain way. Maybe that's not the right word, but when she talks about cueing and modeling as a fitness trainer, right, an exercise physiologist, personal trainer, that fitness professionals you are intuitively doing, right, with your neurotypical clients. However, those cueing and that modeling may never stop for a person who's autistic. The other thing is that cueing and that modeling that she spoke of, that's evidence-based practice. So again, you're doing these things intuitively that can be applied. Yes, there's going to be some learning and a learning curve, but that's there. And then lastly, what she said too, core strength. This is going back. Now, sometimes I get myself in trouble, right? I'm very outspoken, and the reason is to help this community. But when we talk about stuff in the schools, when they assess physically our kids, it's in many ways, it's driven around sport or movements, movement patterns, which is fine. But what about that core strength and stability? These are things that we're going in teaching to schools and saying, look, we got to do glute stuff. We got to do abdominal strength things. And that's, again, where the fitness world has a lot to contribute, especially if those kids are even in a quality physical education program. They still need that extra training. Would you agree, Dr. Haylie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think where the schools sometimes leave off is we'll have kids in physical or occupational therapy, as David said, for specific motor skills. They're focusing particularly on getting a child to walk, getting a child to be able to do handwriting fluently, getting a child to be able to run a certain distance in a certain amount of time. But those demands change as your body changes. And so just because you've been sort of checked off at one stage of development doesn't necessarily mean you don't need continued support as your body changes over time and as you adapt to the new shape of yourself. As your muscle composition changes, you're going to need additional support. As your hormones adjust your body in different ways, you're going to need additional support. And so I think the fitness professional, in my perspective, has really an easy in for a lifelong support role in this community, to say, you know, we can do this with you day to day throughout all of these different phases of life as the demands change, as your body changes, without you having to, you know, qualify by having a fundamental skill that is behind a certain level of achievement. We can just sort of stay with you and help you keep pace with your peers, or help you keep pace with whatever feels correct and comfortable for your body. So yeah, I totally agree with David. And I think the other thing that we often forget too is, in the adapted PE setting, you often have a lot of different types of support needs. You might have kids who have really high physical support needs and kids who have really high social or cognitive support needs. And those are very different to have in a single class. But sometimes an APE instructor is dealing with all of that in a 10 to 12 kid classroom in a very short amount of time. And it's just not always enough to allow the processing time that autistic people often need, to allow adaptation to different sensations, which autistic people often need if they are sensory seeking or sensory averse in different ways. And so fitness professionals, I think, have more opportunity to do this acclimation slowly over time and this instruction slowly over time.
One thing I'm curious about, and I want to get into kind of best practices and really dial in on some of the things you guys were talking about a second ago, but we're having this conversation around, children largely, and kind of that, early stage, like physical literacy development. And it makes a lot of sense to me where they would get that support in the school systems. And I'll just give this question to both of you guys, and whoever wants to answer, or both, please feel free. But what happens when they leave the school system, where there is that structure and that framework and that support? I see the fitness industry is having an opportunity here to intervene and assist, but what's the experience from both of your perspectives on how we can continue to support these people after they get out of the school system, because their needs don't go away?
Yeah, I think you've got a super point. It is a service cliff, right? We just completely drop people off of a cliff of available services as soon as they age out of school systems. And So young adults and older adults who are autistic are just left with very little resource, if any at all. Maybe they are lucky and they have been managed partially by neurology throughout the course of their care. If that's been part of their care team, then maybe the neurologist sees a role for ongoing physical therapy, ongoing occupational therapy, or ongoing just support for motor skill differences in general. But more often than not, what we see is that's around the age where autistic people start to get more sedentary, start to get more isolated, have lower participation in community activities, have lower participation in physical activities, and generally start to have secondary health consequences associated with a lot of these things. And so really what we want to do is make it clear that there are fitness professionals who are comfortable working with them and who are going to make it comfortable for them to engage. And that there are safe spaces for autistic people, that there are gyms that maybe have a quieter time of day where there's not so much banging, clanking, yelling, a time of day where maybe the lights are a little lower for people who aren't comfortable with a lot of visual stimulation, a time of day where there's more one-on-one support, where your trainer's really working just with you and not trying to manage 3 or 4 clients simultaneously. So some of those adjustments are really crucial in order for autistic teens and adults to feel comfortable even engaging in those spaces at all. Otherwise, they're going to just stay home. They're going to stay out of these communities of practice, and they're not going to have the opportunity to benefit from some of the exercises that could really help improve their quality of life.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything about the service cliff that Dr. Haylie said, but then also, right, I think we have to, for the fitness professionals to understand, there's many, a majority, I would say, of curriculum in physical or adapted physical education is driven around sport. Sport is great for some individuals on the spectrum, and it could be the reinforcement over that motivator. However, sport involves 2 of the biggest challenges for those with autism is communication and social skills. So even if it is something that they're engaged in and they're when they're in school or even that transition age, then when they leave, it's hard to go play a pickup game of basketball with 5 people or even 3-on-3, especially if they don't have this social skills to get new friends per se. But then even Michael, what you also said about physical literacy, I know the definition. I don't know the clear definition of physical literacy, but what we have seen in practice for even those high school or transition age students is that there's many adults or those that age group where some of them I've seen don't understand their hands from their feet or their right from their left. And however that was, who's ever responsible for that in the schools, I believe as physical educators, we or they need to be, but that's the foundation of physical literacy in my mind, is that if we're going to teach them sport or teach them their right from their left and how to drive a car or whatever the case may be, we need to start applying that body image and body part identification from the very beginning when these kids are young. And again, I've seen this time and time again. I'm not saying it's every individual, but it was shocking to me that if we're going to start teaching them sport or exercises and things like that, they need to understand just the basics of their body part identification.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think about it like, literacy and numeracy in an academic sense is such an important issue. And we would consider it an American tragedy if kids left school not being able to read and write and do math. Yet we don't view it the same way in the physical domain, and not just, with the neurodivergent population, but even the neurotypical population. This is a problem in adulthood, which is a separate conversation for separate podcasts. So I'll bring us back around here. And this is a podcast that's really for practitioners. This is people who are out in the field that are working with people who want to be working with people who want to be making a difference. So I want to make this next segment of our conversation really practical. And Dr. Miller, I'll kick it back to you. And you we're alluding to some of these things as we're going, but let's get really specific here. What are some best practices, Dr. Miller, first from your perspective, for the fitness professional that is going to start working with these type of individuals?
Yeah, great question. So the very, very, very first thing I would say is don't just look at this community and see business opportunity and dollar signs and just jump in with both feet. As much as we're talking about how much need and opportunity there is, you need to educate yourself first. And one podcast is not enough. You've got to actually get out in the autistic community, talk to autistic people, talk to parents, talk to kids, talk to teens, talk to adults. Make sure that you understand their perspective and where they're coming from. And you'll find that the sort of saying in the community is, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. It's a very heterogeneous population. There are lots of different support needs, lots of different skills. And so thing one for me is always like, get out there, get involved in the community, meet people, get to know people. The other thing that I would say is fitness professionals sometimes have this set it and forget it attitude with clients if they think that their first explanation was really good, right? And I think we all do this in any setting that we instruct in. It's not just fitness professionals, but we'll explain something once. We think we explained it pretty thoroughly. I showed you, I touched the areas of your body you were supposed to move. I put you in the right form. And then I said, okay, go do 10 reps of that and I'll be over here on my phone, or go do 10 reps of that and I'll just kind of be hanging back in the corner. That's not necessarily going to work with this population. This is a population that you may want to schedule fewer of in your day because it is a more intensive one-on-one constant communication type of experience. Just to know that going in and to not stack yourself with multiple kind of interleaved clients, as I have seen folks do sometimes, can be really helpful so that your attention isn't divided. And then the next thing that I would say is, try to figure out where that individual's baseline is before you jump in too deep, because things can be really overwhelming and novelty can be really overwhelming and anxiety producing for autistic people. And so as much as you can, have a conversation, and David can probably speak more to this because it's part of his process as well, but have an intake conversation that's more thorough than what you might do with a neurotypical client. Figure out what type of physical activity that person does on a day-to-day basis. How aware are they of their body parts? Do they have body parts that they feel really comfortable moving and ones that maybe they don't? Sometimes autistic people aren't aware of their motor differences. Sometimes they'll say, oh, yeah, my motor skills are pretty good. And then you directly assess them and their balance is not great and they're tripping and falling and they have difficulty with coordination. So sometimes it takes hands-on assessment. It's not enough to just rely on self-report. And then the last thing that I would say, there's a whole laundry list, we could do this for hours, right? But the last thing that I would say is kind of a big take home is to really think about the sensory environment that you've created around the person. Some autistic people are sensory seeking. They really like loud noise or bright light or lots of visual stimulation or lots of physical touch or deep pressure. Some autistic people hate those things. And some folks are a mix of both. We've had some people come through the lab who are very auditory averse, but very visual seeking. And so you have to know the sensory profile of the person you're working with so that you know, do we need like loud music and headphones? Because that really helps you stay focused and gets you jazzed to do whatever activity you're going to do. But I need to have the lights low so that you don't get visually overwhelmed. Knowing that intimately for each client is really going to help you create the environment that will allow them to achieve their potential and not instead get distracted by being bothered by different elements of their sensory environment.
That's great.
I'll
Yeah.
stop for a minute because I could go on for a long time.
Well, that's great. But the one thing you said that I want to highlight, which I think is such a good quote to remember, is if you've seen one autistic person, you've seen one autistic person. Whatever degree of individualization that exists with the neurotypical population, it seems like that's so greatly amplified with the neurodivergent population.
Yeah, definitely.
David?
Yeah, no, I can't agree anymore with what Dr. Haylie is saying. But yeah, I think first, like, as one thing I always say, as quick as they come, like a fitness professional may decide to market this and sell this. And first of all, again, you're not going to learn everything in a podcast. Mm-hmm. But as quick as they come, they may leave you twice as fast, because this community is very a tight-knit community of families and individuals. So yeah, you may be well-intended, but if the individuals recognize that, hey, this is all about the money per se, and you don't know what you're doing, it's done. You're done. Second, the other thing is, yeah, typically we always see, especially in community-based fitness programming, come to our fun fitness class. Look, exercise is not fun, right? It's not fun for anyone. If it was, we wouldn't have the obesity epidemic that we do, right? It takes work, it takes energy, and it takes effort. But the key to that fun experience is the trained professional who understands this community, who's using evidence-based practices to communicate with them and recognize their needs. And then that will make it fun, right? And to Dr. Haylie's point, yeah, that's all a part of the intake process, which we do talk about, right? In our course with ACSM, the Autism Exercise Specialist Certificate, we're trying to break all of this down in 12 hours of learning. And still today, that's not even enough, given my background and Dr. Haylie's too, but, I spent years working with individuals and then went in to be a paraeducator and then taught at a school, an exercise class. And then I guess two other things. One, what Dr. Haylie was saying about, as a trainer, right? Yeah, you may touch them and prompt them in a certain way, but what about that individual on the spectrum who doesn't want to be touched or won't let you touch them? Now, as a trainer, you're going to be challenged to think differently. And it truly will. This population can make you a better trainer for all of your community, all the people you serve. So you have to think about that too. So, and I think lastly, as we always say, and again, this is not going to solve your problem if you leave here, but one of the biggest things that you can do as a trainer, and you see this in equipment today, is have a visual, right? To explain what that movement or what you're trying to get them to do. Again, that's just one piece of it. That's not going to solve the problem. But think of when you go to a gym or a piece of equipment now, they have a small visual representation of what the exercise is. That's a help. But again, you need to educate yourself so you can best serve this community.
I want to just follow up on two things that David mentioned. So in terms of, needing to use different cues and be flexible and have visuals and all that, I think we've been talking about a lot of supports you could put in place for someone who needs supports, but I do just really want to emphasize another really important principle of working with anyone with a disability is to presume competence, right? So our chief purpose here is to assume that you can, and we start from a place of you can, and then we work backwards to figure out what support you need in order to be able to. And I see this mistake sometimes with people who are new in working with autistic individuals, that they maybe always turn and talk to the parent and don't talk to the individual, or they work with the individual and they speak in a child sort of focused tone of voice to an adult. Autistic people can do lots and lots of stuff. Autistic people are often very, very intelligent, very, very interested in building relationship and communicating with you. And so make sure that the place you're coming from is from that respectful, I assume that you can, and you are the person I'm going to partner with to make it happen, and we're going to work on this together sort of place, rather than from that top-down, more infantilizing approach that I think is not as successful. And that kind of leads into the other thing that David said that I wanted to circle back on. Is I think we've been talking about like all the ways you could mess this up, right? We've been talking about a lot of ways that you could sort of burn your relationship with this community, or that you could do damage to your reputation. But I do want to say that the flip side to this is it is a fiercely loyal community as well. And so once you do build a reputation for being someone who gets it, for being someone who is inclusive and accommodating, for being someone who is accessible in their practice and who's trying to do it right, you will have clients for life. They will go tell everyone they've ever known what a great experience it was with you. And so for just as much as you have to be careful not to burn that trust, once you've got it, it really is an incredible community to be a part of. And I think listening more than guessing is the key there, right? Like asking the questions, how can I help you? Do you want to be touched? I need to show you something. Would you rather I do that with pictures or by touching your body? I need to fix the way that your arm is moving. Do you want me to show you with my body while you touch my body? Or do you want me to position your arm in a particular way? Or do we want to do it when we bring people into the lab? I've had people bring their service dog and we do stuff to the dog. Like, you work around, right? And we have to get a little creative, but to let folks have that agency and to let them weigh in on how you support them is really, really important.
I love it. I love the idea of, starting from the position of we assume that somebody can do it, and then working backwards is such a positive frame of mind and such a productive approach as well. So, Dr. Miller, you're very involved in a lot of aspects of research, and one of my favorite questions to ask any researcher is, what are you seeing? What are you reading? What are you potentially doing in your lab that excites you the most right now, that is coming down the pipes in the journals and the courses like David's produced in the future?
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the things that I'm the most excited about in the field, we were just talking about this in Stockholm 2 weeks ago at a conference. When we first started attending autism conferences, there would be like 2 posters about sensory motor things way in the back on the last day in the last session, and nobody ever came. And it was like pulling teeth to get people to understand that sensory motor features of autism are important, that they're clinically and personally relevant to people, that they have a huge effect on quality of life and participation. And now I'm seeing that there are more and more groups starting to study this from a lot of different angles. They're looking at how sensory motor features affect fall and injury risk, like we do in our lab. They're looking at how they affect other developmental milestones like language and cognition and access to early developmental resources. They're looking at how they affect social communication, how interpersonal distance and the way you hold your body can affect your relationships. And so I think there's just a lot more research in this area in general that is super exciting to me. What we have started to do as a lab is more and more we're trying to do what we call mixed methods research. So instead of only doing things like motion capture, where we're looking at joint angles and these very biomechanical types of variables, now we're doing that and asking autistic people, how did that feel to your body? What was your experience of that movement? Tell us about the sensory environment and how that affected you from your perspective, to try to help us interpret the data more effectively in a way that's more ecologically valid or more meaningful in the real world. And that's the thing that's the most exciting to me that I see happening right now, is this embracing of mixed methods research and a recognition that autistic people's perspectives matter, and that we can't do research without that community's input. Because if we do, we follow this very medicalized model and we end up with results that aren't really all that meaningful. So that's where I'm excited. And my graduate student is doing an auto photography study where she's going to have autistic people take photos of environments that they find challenging for walking and submit them with some information about what was challenging for them. That'll be sort of the lead into her dissertation, which will be exciting.
That's great. Yeah, the ecological validity point, I think, is so important. I mean, it's great to do high-end kinematic analysis and understand the biomechanics, but ultimately, at the end of the day, particularly given the uniqueness of this population, getting their input and getting their feedback, I think, is so important. David, your episode was about 8 months ago or so that we recorded, just you and I, and you're involved in a lot of things. I know you and I end up at conferences and in conversations pretty frequently. What are you seeing right now from the more practical and applied side of things that's exciting you?
I mean, we've just, it should be launching. It should be launched by now. But, the ACSM, our Autism Exercise Specialist Certificate course, it's been updated. It's fully asynchronous, and we've done that for a number of reasons. But one of those is to be able to reach more people. But it's now supported in research. There's another research study being conducted on it, and so that's exciting. But also, recently I was presenting, and someone spoke up in my presentation, and Dr. Haylie and I'll find out the information to share with you. But they said that autism, it was a whole conference based on autism, but they were saying that autism is being considered like a movement disorder, or there's been that thought of it. I don't know, but I found that interesting because what this person who attended was a psych background doctor, and said that the whole conference was driven about movement, and which is obviously, I guess, exciting to hear. But just knowing that, right, that we know that movement plays a critical role in their development, not just from the physical development, but the cognitive, the speech, the academic, everything. It's so critical. So that is good. And then lastly, what Dr. Haylie said too about, asking the individuals. Just a quick short story, but we had an individual that grew up going into a squeeze machine, right? And that's to help regulate their sensory system. And many in the autism community know about this. But while we were shooting videos, she laid down on a stability ball just to take a break, laid on the stability ball and said, this reminds me of a squeeze machine. And the reason I share that is because, look, a squeeze machine is $6,000. Laying on a stability ball, this stability ball is $20, or it's sitting in someone's, basement right now, not doing anything. But the point is that may not elicit the same response for every person on the spectrum, but to have that modality there in your exercise setting, or to give them a calm break, or to let a parent know, hey, if they're feeling a little or not regulated, maybe just let them lay on this ball and see what could happen. But how would we, Dr. Haylie, anyone ever know this unless we ask the individual? And she just spoke up and said it. So anyways, I know I went a little tangent there.
No, that's great. What I'm hearing from both of you is that the conversation is becoming more prominent. This is becoming something that is more mainstream, more talked about, more resources behind it. David, the ACSM moving your program to asynchronous, which allows it to be more accessible, I think is very exciting. And the fact that the three of us are here talking about this right now, I think is a testament to the importance that this plays, not only in the fitness community, but in the public health and the healthcare community. Before we end, go ahead, Haylie, please.
I have one more thing just to so Dave was talking about like regulation. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about today, but that is probably pretty relevant for fitness professionals to know, is if you've ever seen somebody autistic doing what we call stimming or self-stimulatory behaviors, that might be flapping or rocking or bouncing, flicking their ears or chewing on a shirt. It's really important that we see those behaviors as communication. Those behaviors are telling us something. They're telling us the individual is aroused in some way, either excited or stressed or anxious, or needs something to help them regulate. And so one of the things that I see folks do sometimes is try to stop those behaviors. They'll say, no, don't flap or stop bouncing. And instead of trying to constrain behavior, what we can do is redirect to other activities, or let the behavior happen if it's not harmful and let them get it out, or ask if the person is verbally communicative. Are you feeling okay? Are you stressed or are you happy? I noticed that you've started flapping your hands, which is totally fine. This is an okay space for that. I just want to check in and make sure there's nothing I can do to make you more comfortable. And so I think sometimes we fail to think about behavior as communication. The STEM behaviors are definitely communicating something to us and are not something that's quote unquote challenging behavior to be stopped or constrained, but definitely serves a self-regulatory purpose for the individual.
Such a great point. I'm very glad you brought that up, because I think, those of us that maybe aren't familiar with that type of behavior would possibly look at it as maladaptive, but you're right. Just being curious about it, very important. Mm-hmm. Well, both of you, this has been a great conversation. David, I'm always enlightened, when you and I have a chance to talk about this, and Dr. Miller, you bringing in the research piece, I think is so fascinating. David, we'll go with you first. If people want to learn more about the great work that you and your team are doing, where can they go?
Yeah, just go to exerciseconnection.com. Everything is there.
Perfect. And we'll link up to that on the show notes page, as well as your previous podcast episode that dove a little deeper into some more of the practical elements and applied elements of this. Dr. Miller, how about you? Where can people go to find out all the great work you're doing at your lab?
Great question. So on our lab website, which is kines.umich.edu/MVD lab, and Mike, I'll make sure that you have that link to put with the podcast link. But the other thing that I'll mention is we are super active on Twitter. We love to engage with the community, and that's a great place to find the autistic community as well. And so it's a good place to have these conversations out in the open and to get more feedback. If you are thinking about going into this field, put yourself out there, use the hashtag autistic, and ask for autistic people's opinions and just see what their feedback is. And it's a great way to get some extra education.
Awesome. And so we'll link up to both of those on the show notes page. And Dr. Miller, I'll direct the last question of the podcast to you, because David already had a chance to answer this. My thesis behind this podcast is that there's a gap in communication and trust between fitness professionals in the medical community. From your perspective, if you were to tell fitness professionals one thing to do to close off that gap, what would that one thing be?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think that one thing would probably be to come and talk with all of us over here and let us come and talk with you. I know our lab is always interested in coming and doing professional development types of things. A lot of the time we do that for free if we think there's a community need for it and it's compelling. We love to just have the conversation of where your scope of practice begins and ours ends and vice versa, and to really think of yourself as part of a whole care team. Don't get stuck in that sense that, well, I'm not a physician or I'm not a PT or I'm not an OT and so I can't. Think of yourself as an integral next step once that person has been discharged from a clinical service to continuing their lifelong care and continuing their lifelong wellness journey. And I think, just having those ongoing interprofessional conversations is super, super important. So I welcome that. Anybody who's interested is very welcome to contact the lab. We're happy to chat anytime.
Awesome. Very much. Reach out and have the conversation. Dr. Miller, David, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
Thank you, Mike. It was great to chat.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with David and Dr. Miller as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares make a real difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 102. Please be on the lookout for the next episode when it drops in 2 weeks. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again next, please be well